2:13 hours, just 120 kilometers east of the Kremlin, a dark shape slipped low across the frozen pines, hugging the terrain so closely that its shadow almost merged with the treetops. To most of Moscow's massive defensive network, it was invisible, just another cold void moving through the night. But it wasn't alone. 5 more were following behind it, spaced at irregular intervals, flying a staggered pattern designed to confuse the tracking algorithms of air defenses. And all 6 were racing toward the same target, the Shatura Power Station, the largest thermal power plant supplying Moscow's eastern grid. A piece of infrastructure so critical that, on paper, it should have been untouchable. Tonight, Ukraine intended to prove otherwise. Inside the perimeter, the power station thrummed along normally, massive transformers humming like metallic giants lumbering in the cold as they supplied power to the region. 50,000-liter tanks filled with superheated insulating oil simmered behind steel casings. Transmission pylons crackled faintly, steam curling from the plant's rooftop vents. Shatura had survived a long history of Soviet winters, post-USSR neglect, modernization of its equipment and operations, even an accidental fire that threatened to destroy a portion of its architecture. What it had never experienced, and what Moscow would never have thought possible, was a coordinated kamikaze drone strike designed to break it. At 02:14, an alarm blared from a hidden bunker 1.2 kilometers away. A Pantsir S-1 air defense system snapped awake to find itself suddenly under threat. The radar operators jolted upright, eyes darting to their radar scopes. A contact had appeared, already well inside its engagement envelope. Impossible, they thought. But the facts in front of them proved impossibility had become past tense. Operator 1 slammed the Engage command. A 57 E-6 interceptor missile shrieked upward, leaving a vortex of ice crystals spiraling in its wake. It climbed for 1.5 seconds, locked on, then streaked like lightning towards the Ukrainian UAV and remorselessly smashed into the target with a bloom of orange fire that illuminated the pine canopy. Drone number 1 was gone. Crisis averted. For 2 seconds, the operators were able to let themselves breathe. But the adrenaline spike had barely faded back to baseline before the cold dark revealed even more danger. Suddenly, 3 more contacts appeared on their screens. Then, like a nightmare, 2 more trailing behind the new set that had just showed themselves. His relief evaporated, replaced by the thrill of engagement. That thrill would soon be replaced by another feeling, terror. Shatura wasn't facing a single intruder or a small flock. It was facing a swarm. Without hesitation, the operators got to work. Tracer fire erupted from the Pantsir's twin-2 A38M cannons, spraying 30mm shells into the tree line. The barrels glowed red, kicking out a torrent of fire at more than 2,500 rounds per minute. Branches exploded into splinters, showering the snow with debris. Drone number 2 banked sharply left, dipping beneath the radar beam behind a tree line, slipping under the gun's depression angle where the cannons couldn't follow. Drone number 3 hugged the ground, zigzagging through the terrain like a hawk hunting its prey. Drone number 4 cleared the oncoming defensive fire and disappeared behind the plant's perimeter wall like a phantom. Drones 5 and 6 broke off entirely, looping wide around the cooling towers, repositioning themselves for another run. Every time Russian operators solved one problem, Ukrainian ingenuity created another. Inside the Pantsir cabin, alarms overlapped, a discordant choir of radar pings, proximity warnings, and thermal signatures flickering in and out. The operators were now fighting on 2 fronts, the swarm outside and a new battle inside their own minds. They struggled to find next steps and maintain situational awareness. But the swarm was moving faster than they could think, and the obvious coordination of this attack was more potent than their suddenly outdated engagement playbooks could systematically manage. "These returns are too small!" Operator 1 shouted. "Where's the second jammer? Where's the backup unit?" No answer. Every second of silence was its own confirmation. Shatura was alone in the dark. They now faced a half-dozen munitions-laden carbon fiber attackers with radar cross-sections the size of birds and engines with whispering acoustic signatures that blended into the wind while streaking nearly 110 miles per hour. But these weren't GPS zombies. They were guided by inertial navigation hardened against Russia's electronic warfare tactics. They used laser altimeters and terrain-following profiles mapped from satellite imagery. And in FPV mode, they frequency-hopped dozens of times per second so Russia's jammers couldn't break their lock. It all but guaranteed the destruction of whatever they were hunting. Without warning, drone number 2 broke from the tree line, climbing sharply to clear a service scaffold. The Pantsir operator, hoping against hope, swung the turret and fired. Too late. The drone dove behind the turbine hall and vanished below the radar horizon again. Quickly, drone number 3 followed suit, using the plant's buildings as cover. Drone number 4 skimmed just above the snow, passing directly under the cannon's firing arc. The Pantsir could track multiple targets, but it could only attack one at a time, and against these tactics, it was essentially useless. And the swarm knew that. "Commander, they're too close!" Operator 1 called out, following up with, "We need another battery! Now!" But Moscow's vaunted multi-layer defense had a fatal flaw. It was built to counter cruise missiles and aircraft, not dozens of cheap, agile, semi-autonomous kamikazes slipping under and around every radar layer they could blanket over their infrastructure's soft spots. Shatura's defenses were being peeled open like the layers of an onion. By 0215, only 2 blips remained on the pantsir's monitor, and that, most certainly, was not a good thing. One approached from the west at 80 meters altitude. The other skimmed in from the east at barely 15 meters, weaving unpredictably between buildings. The operator had seconds to make a decision for just how ugly this was going to get. If he shot the high one, the low one would strike the transformers. But if he shot the low one, the high one would smash into the turbine hall. Both were likely to cripple the plant's operations. He had 1 turret, 2 targets, and 0 good choices. And 3 drones he still couldn't see. His commander screamed, "Just shoot, now!" Training and instinct kicked in. Operator 1 chose the western contact. "Engaging west target," he called across the pantsir. The cannons roared as they unleashed their metal rain, tracers desperately carving through the air towards the higher drone. 4 shells struck the target, and drone number 5 exploded in a shower of sparks and scraps that now plummeted uselessly to the ground. 1 threat down, 4 left, and only 1 that he still had a visual on. The surviving drones had waited for exactly this moment. Suddenly, drone number 6 burst from behind the administration building, engines screaming at full throttle, altitude barely 10 meters off the ground. Operator 1 swung the turret, but he was too slow. He fired. Rounds sparked off a metal gantry. A few shells ripped through the snow. Nothing had hit the drone. At 0216, the UAVs crossed the final 300 meters. 2 of their EO sensors locked onto the largest target, Transformer 3, filled with 50,000 liters of mineral insulating oil, the other 2 bearing down on the slightly smaller 40,000-liter tank of Transformer number 1, their warheads armed automatically. 200 meters, the drones zigzagged through a final burst of cannon fire. Muzzle flashes reflected off their carbon fiber skin. 100 meters, a glancing hit sheared a chunk off Drone 3's right wing, but the autopilot compensated instantly. 50 meters, the Transformer's massive steel frame was as good as gone. Impact. A white flash arced through the sky as 2 drones struck. A series of concussive thumps that shook windows across Shatura's entire district. Transformer 3 exploded. Mineral oil vaporized into a roaring pillar of fire. Steel plates tore apart like paper. Copper coils burst outward in molten ribbons. Then seconds later, the final 2 UAVs hit Transformer 1. The second explosion ripped through the switchyard mercilessly. By sheer consequence, Transformer 2 ignited, another 40,000-liter torch that lit the sky with a plume visible from kilometers away. The temperature jumped to 1,000 degrees Celsius in seconds. The firestorm reached the nearby structures. Shatura's main output dropped to 0. Lights went out across the nearby town of 33,000 residents, and the broader effects for the region Shatura fed could not yet be known. Temperatures outside hovered below freezing. Inside the power station, workers sprinted for extinguishers and foam lines. Hopeless. A transformer fire burns like a living thing. It cannot simply be put out. Shatura's crisis report triggered the largest emergency mobilization in the region in years. 137 personnel, 49 vehicles, foam tenders, water cannon trucks, mobile boiler trucks, a specialized firefighting train from Moscow, grid technicians, hazard teams, police cordons. Firefighters drenched the outer buildings to prevent a secondary explosion. Pieces of steel shot into the sky like flaming shrapnel. Any attempt to approach the burning transformers was life-threatening. By dawn, they managed to contain the inferno, but the damage was catastrophic. The main transformer yard had been destroyed. 3 transformers melted into slag, its transmission lines warped into useless metal sculptures, and a section of the switchyard floor collapsed from heat. The control room was rendered inoperable. Shatura's operational capacity had been reduced to nothing. By 6 a.m., Moscow rushed to control the narrative. The fire is contained, heating is provided, the situation is stable, but residents saw the towering inferno with their own eyes. They saw the blackout, they felt the cold creeping into their homes. They watched emergency boiler trucks crawl through the streets. They weren't facing some propaganda narrative, it was reality, and the symbolism was devastating. Ukraine had just struck a key power station 75 miles from Red Square and set an unquenchable fire to the assumptions held by Moscow for how impossible something like this should be. Russia's promise that its heartland was untouchable had now been exposed as a myth. This wasn't a one-off incident. That same night, Ukraine launched 75 drones across Russia, Belgorod, Bryansk, Ryazan, Nizhny Novgorod, and Voronezh. A saturation attack so widespread that no air defense system, no matter how modern, could cover every angle. The overcommitment of resources to the front lines had created an imbalance inland for Russia. Things had to be reorganized. The Kremlin now faced a brutal calculus. Each S-400 moved to protect the homeland meant 1 less defending Russian troops in Ukraine. Each pantsir redeployed to guard power plants meant another armored column exposed. Every shift left new vulnerabilities, and Ukraine was watching. As Russian air defense commanders now knew, until they could reposition their resources inland against swarms like these, Russian operators would have to get lucky every time, but Ukraine only needed to be lucky once. That night, Ukraine was more than lucky. It was prepared. By hitting Shatura, Ukraine sent a message written in fire. If Russia plunges Ukrainian cities into cold and darkness, Ukraine now has the means to return the favor inside Russia itself. The age of impenetrable Russian air defense is over, and the most dangerous weapons in the sky aren't billion-dollar aircraft. They're $20,000 drones built in workshops, guided by AI, and flown by teams that refuse to accept impossible as an answer. The rules of this engagement are being rewritten in real time by autonomy, improvisation, and asymmetric brilliance. The burning transformers at Shatura are the latest chapter, but they may not be the last. Stay prepared, stay informed, subscribe for more.